my name is David Kenny, and welcome to Light from Above. I'm broadcasting from wonderful Wadsworth, Ohio. Glad you can join the program and be with us today. Today we're talking about the question, do you know Jesus? And today we're really going to hone in on the idea, did Jesus really exist? These questions, they remind me of a song that was written by an Celus and a Lackey. They wrote a hymn around 1957 called Do You Know My Jesus? And they have questions in the song like, have you a heart that's weary, tending a load of care? Or who knows your disappointments? Who hears each time you cry? Who understands your heartaches? And then they follow up these verses with this chorus. Do you know my Jesus? Do you know my friend? Have you heard that he loves you and that he will abide till the end? Yet Jesus himself said in Matthew chapter 11, 28 through 30, Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Those are very comforting words. You can buy those on calendars and things like that. They're very comforting. People take a lot of comfort in those. And it's astonishing, Jesus is a very controversial figure. A lot of people don't realize that. But Jesus generated controversy in his lifetime, and he's controversial even to this day. I mean, think about it. He switched the calendar. His life, we went from the whole BC, before Christ, or BCE, before Common Era, to AD, which is Latin for in the year of our Lord. We don't make those kinds of changes lightly. Jesus is the most controversial figure in the history of the world. And it's a shame, a lot of people deny that he even existed. For example, they might think, well, he was just a myth. He's not a historical figure, not like George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or Socrates or Thomas Jefferson. Those are real people. But Jesus, he didn't really exist. There's people out there that believe that kind of thing. They're rare, but they're radical. And they have no hesitation of trying to point out their atheistic viewpoint. And the question is, why do they do that? I mean, what's so harmless about these ideas, that he's going to provide you comfort and strength? But yet, they do. They find him very threatening to them. Let's give you some examples. First, here we have the Great Soviet Encyclopedia that came out in 1952. It's one of the greatest, most complete, in that sense, encyclopedias that was printed at the time. It was the largest. It had 3 editions. One was 65 volumes, and subsequent editions had smaller volumes, but still had a lot of information in them. And it was heavily biased. It was put out by the Soviet Union, which was the United Soviet Socialist Republic, the USSR. It's no longer in existence anymore. Encyclopedia you can still get, but the Soviet Union is gone. And it's interesting, when President Reagan was confronting the Soviet Union about their idea to expand worldwide communism, some of the press would come to him and say, you're being provocative. They're not interested in world domination. And they really chastised him about it. But he pointed out in a speech about 30 years ago, the Evil Empire speech, he pointed out, he said, I'm only quoting their own people. And this is what Reagan said. I think I should point out that I was only quoting Lenin, their guiding spirit, who said in 1920 that they repudiate all morality that proceeds from supernatural ideas. That's their name for religion. Or ideas that are outside class conceptions. Morality is entirely subordinate to the interests of class war. Now, people were like stunned. I don't know what they were more stunned about, that the Soviets actually said that Lenin and Stalin and Marxists and all that stuff actually said it, or that Reagan knew about it, or that Reagan was going to use it. It wasn't any secret. It was not any secret what they were trying to do. Well, notice the quote here from this encyclopedia, what they said. Jesus, the name of the mythological founder of Christianity. Now, that shows you their attitude towards him. But the Soviet Empire, they would go even further. They actually issued a book called the Atheist Handbook. Now, here's a picture of what the book looked like. And it came out in 1959. Khrushchev was the one that put it out. He was out there to suppress Christianity. He's not the one that wrote it. The guy that wrote it was named Kokolev. He lived from 1886 to 1960. He was a Soviet historian. He had a doctorate of historical sciences. He taught at the University of Leningrad from 1924 to 1956. He's a director of Museum of the History of Religion and Atheism from 1956 to 1960. And he's credited as being the first author of the Marxist historical textbook of the ancient world. Now, make no mistake, the hostility against Jesus. And this is what it says right here in the book. Now, this is from an English translation of it. It's in Russian. But the translators here, which was put out in this format, I cited the source there for you. Science has long since established that Jesus Christ never existed, that the figure of the alleged founder of Christianity is purely mythical. Now, they had a reason for doing that. They were atheistic secularists. They preached the supremacy of the state. They didn't like the idea that religion, the Bible, that Jesus could determine morals, especially if their morality conflicted with Jesus' morality. They didn't like that. And so they would attack Christianity. And what better way to attack it than things like, well, Jesus never existed. He's just a myth. His teachings are irrelevant. We can just, it's just like any other mythological teaching. What you really need to pay attention to is what the secular state tells you, what we tell you. Now, the Soviet Union may be gone, but that attitude is with us today. Make no mistake about it. It's even within our country. Now, Marx and Karl Marx and Lenin, these guys that wrote these things, they're dead. And the Soviet Union is gone. But their philosophy, their ideas live on. And we have people in our own country who spout these kinds of things and don't even realize where they came from. And that's something that's very concerning to us. Why do you think there's any correlation where you see, not all the times, but a lot of times you see an atheist who also is a communist or a Marxist or a Leninist, or he espouses the same ideas? Why is that? I don't think it's a coincidence. They have common viewpoints. They have common standards. But you know what? The communists weren't the only ones to do that. The Soviet Union wasn't the only one to deny that Jesus existed. Notice this writer here, Bertrand Russell. He lived from 1872 to 1970. He was British. He is a philosopher and a skeptic. He had a provocative book against Christianity called Why I Am Not a Christian. And a lot of atheists really liked it and probably still do. And he, notice a couple things that he said. He says, I think there are a good many points upon which I agree with Christ a great deal more than professing Christians do. Now, that's what he said in the book right before this statement I have on the screen. Now think about that. Here's a guy that denies that Jesus ever existed. Yet he says, I agree with Christ a great deal more than professing Christians do. And I'm like, really? Really? I mean, have you ever noticed people who do that? They'll say, oh, I believe in Jesus. I really admire his writings, until they find something they don't like. And then they're ready to do away with that. He also pointed out, Russell did in his book on judging, he says, judge not lest ye be judged. He would quote that, and he would try to tell people that they were not obeying that by calling out truth versus error, or right versus wrong. And he would say, well, Jesus said, judge not that you be not judged. It's interesting, he could quote that passage, but he wasn't paying attention to the context. Every once in a while in the paper, in our local paper, I still see it. It's not uncommon if somebody's debating with someone about a moral issue, the person who's losing the argument will say, well, judge not. You can't say that. Judge not, that you be not judged. You can't judge me. And they try to misuse Jesus' words against this person who's taken a stand on morality. But they're doing it falsely or incorrectly, and they don't even know it probably. For example, Jesus himself said in John 4:24, do not judge according to appearance, but judge righteous judgment. So Jesus is condemning a specific kind of judging when he made the statement that people often quote. It was being hypocritical judging, which I find sort of ironic that they do that. Trying to use Jesus' words to try to silence Christians for speaking up for Jesus' standards of morality. I just find that it's sort of interesting they try to do that, but people do it all the time. They misquote him whenever it suits them, no matter how they get it. Now, Bertrand Russell made the claim that he doubted the existence of Christ. And here's what he said from his book. Historically, it's quite doubtful whether Christ ever existed at all. And if we did not know him, anything about him, so that I am concerned with the historical question, which is a very difficult one. So he's trying to tell you, well, I don't believe that Jesus ever existed. But yet he agrees with a lot of things he said, even though he's mythological. But it would be a mistake to think that Russell, who passed away in 1970, that, well, these are just old people. These are old people. Nobody believes this stuff anymore. We'll take a look at an example of this book, Losing Faith in Faith. This is by Dan Barker. Dan Barker, from what I understand, used to be a Pentecostal preacher, and he decided that he didn't believe in the Bible anymore, so he decided that he was going to go from advocating the gospel to advocating atheism. And he's very hostile and he's very outspoken about it. And notice his statement about Jesus. There is serious doubt that Jesus ever existed. It is impossible to prove he was a historical figure. It is much more plausible to consider Jesus' character to be the result of myth-making, a human process that is indeed historically documented. Now, there may be a doubt in Dan Barker's mind about the existence of Christ, but there is no doubt with the historical record. There is no doubt. Jesus definitely existed. You have atheists, you have agnostics, you have all kinds of sources. They'll even admit that he existed. Now let's take a look at some various examples that show that Jesus existed. But it's really important to note, one of my favorite writers is Wayne Jackson. And he wrote, probably one of my favorite articles he wrote was one called The Historicity of Jesus Christ. It appeared in the Spiritual Sword back in April 1996. And he made this statement in that magazine. He said, the religion of Jesus Christ stands or falls upon the events of history. Did Jesus of Nazareth ever live? Is the New Testament data regarding him reliable? This is a crucial question. And he's right. He's 100% correct. If Jesus didn't exist, you better believe these pagans and these atheists and all, they're going to point it out and they're going to say the Bible you believe has a bunch of made up stuff in it. And so it's really an important question. And Christians don't deny that Jesus exists. It's interesting who's denying him. It's the people that don't want to believe him. The people who want to believe him say, yeah, he's a historical figure. He really walked. He really talked. He dwelt among the people. He was an actual human being. He was also God. And yet you have these people that try to make these cases. But notice this statement I found in Josh McDowell's book, Evidence of Christianity. Was Julius Caesar a man or a myth? And he writes in his book, he's quoting F.F. Bruce's book, The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable? And he makes this statement, some writers may toy with the fancy of a Christian myth, but they do not do so on the ground of historical evidence. The historicity of Christ is axiomatic for an unbiased historian as the historicity of Julius Caesar. It is not historians who propagate the Christ myth theories. And he's he's making a good point. Some people would say, well, wait a minute, who would deny that Julius Caesar existed? But they don't ever really look at the evidence for Julius Caesar versus the evidence for Jesus. And there's a lot of evidence for Jesus, more than Julius Caesar. There's more evidence for Jesus. But, atheists, they'll really assert. They'll be really strong. They'll be really adamant and try to convince you by their demeanor that, oh, nobody believes in Jesus. No, he wasn't even a real figure. And try to get you to believe what they're telling you without looking at the evidence. Don't be fooled by that. Look at the evidence. Now, they'll point out that, the evidence, the first century documents are rather lacking. They'll make that criticism. Well, that's a valid criticism, but it's not valid in regards to the existence of Jesus. It's the existence of all the literature of that period. Notice this statement here in the scarcity of the documents of the first century. It says, the truth is precious little material from secular writers of the first century has ever survived to this day. The late Ian Blacklock addressed this matter in one of his books. Dr. Blacklock taught ancient and biblical history for more than 40 years and was internationally recognized as an authority of the classical writings of antiquity. In discussing the surviving literature of the 50s and 60s of the first century, the professor writes, bookends set a foot apart on his desk where I write would enclose the works from those significant years. So, it's important to note that. He's not talking about the books of the Bible. He's talking about all the books from that period of time. And that's important to remember. And perhaps you don't realize that, Caesar's work, Gallic Wars, he wrote that about between 144 BC And people, we may not remember what those were about, but we recognize those as historical works that Caesar wrote those things. But we don't maybe realize that from the time that Caesar wrote that work until the time we have the copy of it, 1,000 years has passed. We only have 20 copies of Gallic Wars by Caesar. 20. Have any idea how many copies of the New Testament we have that are less than 1,000 years apart from the original writing? We'll find out in just a minute. Let's take a look at the Greek New Testament. Here's a picture of the Greek New Testament. This is papyrus number 46, which is 2 Corinthians 11 through 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. It's dated between 175 to 225 AD. And notice I have down there 5,000 plus copies of the Greek New Testament. Now, atheists will point out, yeah, but none of them from the first century. And they would be correct. However, recent discovery has found what's being reported as a first century copy of the Gospel of Mark. And the news about that is supposed to be coming out. But you can't dismiss the Greek New Testament. Now, some people want to do that because they'll say, well, that's biased. That's biased. You can't count that. Well, since when did secular writings become exempt from bias? Since when was that? Remember that great Soviet encyclopedia? You think it wasn't biased? It definitely was biased. We have bias all over the place. We have to go and do our research, weigh the options, look at the evidence. And that's important that we do that. So some people want to dismiss the Greek New Testament, but it's one of the greatest evidences for Jesus. I mean, why do we have all these copies? There's no other work like it in the world. Why? If Jesus was just a myth, why would we have all these copies that we have? Because he's not a myth. People were willing to die to preserve those writings. They were willing to go to their deaths on their faith that Jesus is the Son of God. Not a myth. Not a myth. So atheists, their attempt to try to dismiss the Greek New Testament as evidence because it's biased, there's plenty of bias to go around when it comes to their interpretation of bias. But let's examine some extra biblical sources for Jesus being a historical person. Let's take a look at some secular sources. First example would be Tacitus. Tacitus lived about 56 to 117 AD. He wrote the Annals of Rome. You can still buy it. He was a historian of the Roman Empire. He was also a Roman senator. So keep that in mind. He wrote his Annals about 116 AD. Now some people want to point out, they'll criticize what Tacitus wrote, and they'll say, well, that's 116 AD. That's not first century. Well, it's only 16 years away, number one. Number two, he was alive in 56 AD. He was alive before the New Testament was completely written. So he is a first century testifier of the situation. So this idea that some of these atheists, oh, well, that doesn't count because the date of the book is not before 100 AD. Well, that's just false. I mean, they're just being silly. But this is what Tacitus wrote. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christianity, by the populace Christus, which is Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the region of Tiberius on the hands of one of the procurators, Pontius Pilate. And it's interesting, this statement by Tacitus is believed right now to be the oldest ancient non-Christian source reference to Jesus Christ. He was a real person. Tacitus knew it. There was no doubting about whether or not Jesus existed. Tacitus was there. He would know. People today, he never existed. He was just a myth. Well, Tacitus wouldn't agree with that. He wouldn't agree with that at all. Let's ask yourself a question. Which copies are valid? Which copies are valid? Take a look. Here's Tacitus' work, the Annals of Rome, written about 100 AD. The earliest copy we have of it is 1100 AD. We have about 20 copies of it. This is from Josh McDowell's book, The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict. We have a 1,000-year gap between Tacitus wrote that work and the copies we have today. But what about the New Testament? New Testament, we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, Paul, James, and Jude as a writer. It's the Greek New Testament, date written around 100 AD, a little before. Earliest complete copy we have, 325 AD right now. Now there's fragment copies of it way before this period. And that's important to note. Number of copies we have of the Greek New Testament, over 5,300 we have. The gap of years between the earliest complete copy and when it was written, about 675 years. And you know, the interesting thing, when you take that 1,000-year gap in Tacitus' work, and you start plugging in that 1,000-year period for the Bible, you're going to find out not only do we have a whole lot of Greek manuscripts in that time frame, we have other translations of that Greek text that were made in that time frame. We have early church fathers who quoted those texts. The Bible, the New Testament, is one of the most preserved books, the most preserved book in antiquity. There's no doubt. There's no doubt. It's just something to keep in mind. But let's take a look at, there's other Roman sources we could look at too before we move on. For example, Pliny. Pliny was a governor of Bithynia. He wrote a letter to Emperor Trajan. He talked about Jesus and his followers. Also, Suetonius, he was a Roman writer of 120 AD. He wrote about them as well and about Jesus. So Tacitus isn't the only one. I just put Tacitus up there because he's the closest one to the time frame. But he's not the only one that mentioned Jesus. And they always mention him as a living figure, as a real figure, not mythological. I mean, Jesus has been dead before that. Died, buried, rose, went to heaven. By the time these writers wrote. But they never doubted his existence. They never denied it, even though they were Roman historians as well. And as we go on, we'll take a look at some Jewish sources as well. Take a look at this from Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish historian. He lived from 37 to 100 AD. He wrote several highly respected works of Jewish and Roman history. He makes this statement: "Now there was about this time Jesus a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. For he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these, and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. The tribe of Christians, so named for him, is not extant to this day." Now, some people will cry foul. They'll say, you can't use that passage because there's some doubt about it. There's some textual variance or it. Okay, fine. What about this passage? Take a look at this one from Josephus. "And now Caesar, upon hearing the death of Festus, sent Abanus into Judea as a procurator. But the king deprived Joseph of the high priesthood and bestowed the succession to that dignity on the," and on it goes. But notice the phrase here: "and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ." There's no doubt about this passage. There's no doubt at all. Josephus wrote about Jesus. He's a historical figure. He really existed. He wasn't a myth. But there's other sources too. Some people don't like Josephus. Some of the Jewish people, they don't care for Josephus. They don't like that. So what about the Babylonian Talmud? Here's a statement from that. "On the eve of the Passover, they hung Jesus the Nazarene, and Herod went out before him 40 days, saying, 'Jesus the Nazarene will go out to be stoned for sorcery and misleading the enticing Israel to idolatry. Any who knows anything in his defense must come and declare concerning him.' But no one came to his defense, so they hung him on the eve of the Passover." Now, some Jewish scholars will say, well, there's a little bit, we're not exactly sure if this passage is exactly correct. Fine. Fine. There's other passages in the Talmud that talk about Jesus and his followers. He was a real person. They don't deny that. The Jews didn't deny that Jesus existed. They wanted to deny that he was the Son of God. That they wanted to deny. They wanted to say he wasn't the Messiah. But that he existed, they didn't deny that. They didn't deny it. And also foes against Jesus spoke against him. For example, Celus. Celus was an antagonist. He wrote books against Christianity and against Christ. It's interesting. Celus claimed to be a god himself, but he would blaspheme against Jesus. I have the quote up here. I don't have time to read it to you. But it's interesting that he never doubts whether or not Jesus existed. He doesn't treat him as if he's a myth. He attacks him. It's interesting, we don't have any of Celsus's writings. They haven't been preserved. We have to actually rely on someone that was debating with him to quote Celsus for what Celsus said. So that's sort of it's interesting when you think about preserving in manuscripts. But he wasn't the only one. Here's another one. Polyphar, he was a foe of Christianity. He made this statement: the gods have proclaimed Christ to have been the most pious, but the Christians are a confused and vicious sect. You know, he had also wrote a book called The Life of Pythagoras. He asserts that magicians of pagans exhibit more power than Jesus. Now notice that. He recognizes Jesus had performed amazing powers, doesn't deny that it existed, even though he's a foe against Christianity. And that goes to bias. It's something we need to keep in mind. Another piece of evidence in a different area. What about the Roman catacombs and the artwork that's there? The catacombs are under the city of Rome. They were used for tombs from the 2nd to 5th centuries AD. It was a secret meeting place for a lot of Christians. They had to hide from the state for fear of persecution, so they would go there and they would worship. It had some 600 miles of underground passages containing some 1.175 to 4 million graves. And there's a lot of artwork there, a lot of Christian artwork. And here's a couple examples. Here's someone's idea of what they thought Jesus looked like. Here is a man as the good shepherd, which is allusion to John 10 and verse 11. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for his sheep. So when you go to those catacombs, you have all that art. All that artwork that testifies either to Jesus' existence or to things that Jesus taught. What about all that evidence? For a myth? I don't think so. I don't think so. Well, let's close by taking a look at just summarizing what we've discussed. Did Jesus really exist? We have the Greek New Testament. Even though the atheists want to throw that out, they can't. They can, but they're ignoring a big piece of evidence. You have Roman historians, Jewish historians. You have writings from the Jewish nation. You have pagan critics of Christianity that try to say that Jesus, they try to criticize aspects of him, but they do not deny he existed. And then you have the catacombs and all the artifacts and things like that. To deny that Jesus existed is really absurd. It's really absurd. Do you know Jesus? Thanks for watching our program today. Today, we'd like to take a moment and review this roadmap to heaven with you since the matter is so serious. There are many incorrect set of directions out there, and sadly so many people are following them. For example, some people have been given wrong turns. They believe things such as faith only, works only, or grace only. Or some attempt to change the order of the turns, being baptized before they even believe. Some people fail to realize what point they are on the map. Don't even open their Bibles yet, and they think they're saved already. As a person travels in a car or takes a hike, it has to follow the proper directions, so we must follow the proper directions to heaven. Let's take a look at the directions on our roadmap to heaven here. You have to look at these passages in your Bible for yourself. We'll just list the steps, the turns on the way. First is to believe or to have faith. And then number 2, to repent, to turn away from sin. Number 3 is to confess that Jesus is the Son of God. Number 4 is immersion, or to be baptized, which is a burial in water to have your sins washed away. And then you're added to the church by the Lord, not by a group of people, or not by giving some kind of testimonial experience or things like that. And then once you're added, you need to serve and worship the Lord faithfully all the days of your life. And the key word's faithfully. You don't waver. And that's very important. We need to keep in mind, too, that in Noah's day there was a big flood, and only people in the ark were saved from the flood. The same is true today. There is no salvation outside the Lord's church. Where are you on the roadmap to heaven? Thanks for watching our program. Please let us know if we can assist you with further information for your journey.